50 years ago, the Children's Television Workshop came out of nowhere and changed the face of American children's television forever. Unlike Britain, America had little or no tradition of educational television, particularly for preschoolers, beyond the odd independently made micro-budgeted puppet show on public access. Even Mr. Rogers was just getting started. And then Joan Gans Cooney teamed up with Jim Henson and created almost a whole new genre. Sesame Street was a phenomenon within a year in its native United States. Big Bird, Oscar the Grouch, Count Von Count, Cookie Monster and the rest, though still somewhat unformed, were well on their way to the status of children's TV demigods. It was so different, so unique, and so downright good that within months, television companies from around the world were beating down the workshop's door, asking for permission to develop their own versions. And so Sesame Street became a worldwide phenomenon. Except in Britain. While the likes of Germany, Brazil and Belgium all contacted the CTW themselves, contacts which in each case resulted in a special co-produced native version, the British were silent. Eventually the workshop themselves specifically contacted the BBC about the possibility of a British Sesame Street. And the BBC recoiled in horror. Unlike America, Britain did have a history of educational children's programming, particularly for preschoolers. Not coincidentally, we also have a history of public service broadcasting. From Picture Book to Jackanory to the then relatively new Play School, television and the radio before it had been used as a teaching aid here long before it occurred to the Americans to do so. So when Sesame Street came knocking, the BBC argued we didn't need it. And what's more, we didn't want it, because it was wrong. It was wrong on a basic and fundamental level for a start. It was all in John Webster's bastardisation of English. Taps referred to as faucets, pavements as sidewalks, Oscar the Grouch, who didn't even have the decency to be green yet, living in a trash can rather than an honest-to-goodness dustbin. And as for the zip codes, where would you even begin explaining that mess to your child in 1970? This is a program that's supposed to teach our children the alphabet, and it couldn't even get that right.
Y. Z.
It's Z. Damn your eyes. This was not, of course, an unassailable problem. The CTW were already co-producing full-blown foreign language versions. They wouldn't have objected to doing the same in tandem with the BBC. An original British remake of Sesame Street. Just imagine, Derek Griffiths as the British Gordon, Brian Cant as Mr. Hooper, Fred Harris and a young Jeremy Irons patiently explaining the alphabet to a version of Big Bird with the voice of Nigel Plaskett. A truly utopian vision that the BBC had no interest in whatsoever.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1.
It wasn't just the linguistic differences between America and Britain that they objected to, it was the entire colonial attitude. They were loud and brash and, quite frankly, vulgar. And if they weren't, Britain really wanted them to be, enough to make it so regardless. Play School, Britain's closest equivalent to that point, never raised its voice above an eerie, modulated friendliness, like cult members on sedatives. Its puppets were stuffed animals who didn't talk at all. Sesame Street, by comparison, was loud and obnoxious, full of fuzzy monsters and yelling. The BBC's head of children's programmes, Monica Sims, put it down to where it came from. This was explicitly for disadvantaged American children, who by their nature were cruder and noisier and just inherently worse than British ones, all of whom preferred climbing trees, drinking ginger beer, and solving mysteries whilst wearing +4s and sensible sweaters. In television terms, America had no tradition of commercial-free public service broadcasting. and therefore no tradition of quality control, resulting in their settling for far lesser programmes than the ones the BBC was already making, like Play School and Blue Peter. Sesame Street might have been perfectly adequate for them, but we knew better. This kind of infuriating exceptionalist snobbery was unfortunately typical of the BBC at the time. In many ways it's typical of the British in general, with the BBC acting as an amplifier. Removing it was a large part of the motivation behind the introduction of competition, but clearly 15 years wasn't long enough. Another decade or two of deregulation, demonisation and ritual humiliation would see the corporation transformed into the cringing government yes-men we know and love today. But I digress. Worse, the BBC saw something sinister in the CTW's technique. Demonic as Sims, Sesame Street was actively authoritarian, even anti-democratic. Its mission statement even explicitly referred to a desire to change children's behaviour. The British had always been slightly afraid of television and its potential to indoctrinate, a legacy of the notoriously TV sceptic John Reith, who couldn't help but associate it with his father, the Reverend Dr. George Reith, declaiming about the torments of hell on a weekly basis. Even though all Sesame Street was declaiming was the alphabet, basic numeracy, and the general preferability of niceness to nastiness, the BBC shuddered at the very principle. Educating was important, of course. It was the second of the three famous principles at the heart of the BBC. After inform, but before, a long way before, entertain. But that's what programmes for schools and colleges were for. And while those could have a little bit of entertain mixed in, just enough to make sure that bastards kept paying attention to the screen while they were being educated, Sesame Street proposed to do it the other way around, ladling hard education into explicit entertainment. And this, to the BBC, was abomination. As the argument became increasingly public, the BBC started to look into face-saving compromises. Maybe they could show it in schools, or bits of it anyway. Multiple educators and similar professionals watched it, both off their own bat and by invitation. The worst anyone had to say was that it was brash and vulgar, but utterly lovable. Or that some of the teaching techniques were a little old-fashioned, but that the overall effect is marvellous. Sims and the BBC were not to be swayed. Sesame Street would never air on the corporation's frequencies. Not only could they do better, not only had they done better, thank you very much, they had a remit to do better. To show Sesame Street would be like a surrender. The workshop didn't give up yet, however. If the OGs of public service broadcasting proved sadly disappointing, it could still take it to the commercial interests. And so, by 1971, discussions moved on to ITV. This had its own complications, of course, because ITV wasn't a single company at the time, but a network of regional companies regulated by the ITA. This added obstacle to merely broadcasting the show in the first place meant the idea of a co-production was tabled. The ITA shared some of the BBC's objections to the workshop's teaching techniques, but were more receptive to the idea of showing Sesame Street purely from a commercial perspective. By 1971, it was already one of the biggest and most acclaimed children's properties in America. It was worth looking into, if nothing else. So the ITA agreed to dip a toe into the waters. In April 1971, Sesame Street finally made its British television debut on a trial basis with a 3-week test run in the HTV region only, Wales and the west of England. The test went well, with healthy ratings and a good reception for the show itself. But the ITA still wasn't certain, and passed the buck over to their own schools committee. They commissioned a second test run, with HTV this time joined as guinea pigs by Grampian Television and London Weekend. A further 13 episodes were transmitted daily over 3 weeks in December on HTV, and on Saturdays over 13 weeks in Grampian and on London Weekend. By and large, this second trial was also a success. The report commissioned alongside it found that while educators still despised it, sometimes with a passion, kids and their parents loved it, even if the parents thought it was a bit too American at times.
Hi-ho, Kermit the Frog, here today to talk to you about a very interesting letter, the letter Z.
It's Z. Still, on balance, the ITA and its schools committee gave the participants the green light to carry on broadcasting it if they wished, and the rest of the network permission to take it on at their own discretion. Grampian passed, but HTV and London Weekend happily carried on into 1972. Sesame Street finally had a home on British television. Sort of. It could be seen in Wales, it could be seen in Swindon, and at weekends it could be seen in London. But that federalised ITV structure meant it wasn't on national television yet, and wouldn't be for quite some time. The various ITV regions gradually succumbed to the charms of Big Bird, Grover, Oscar and the rest, and cleared a space in their schedules, usually daily, but sometimes weekly. First of all was Granada, who started showing Sesame Street in July 1972. Ulster took it on from New Year 1973, and Westwood began putting it out on weekends from May of that same year. A minor step backward came in August of 1973 when London Weekend temporarily dropped it, but they reversed that decision in 1978. Meanwhile, in 1974, ATV broadcast the one-off special Julie on Sesame Street, starring Julie Andrews and inevitably directed by Blake Edwards, but then they kind of had to because it was filmed at their Elstree studios. 2 years later, ATV's parent company were responsible for Jim Henson finally getting the resources to make the Muppet Show at the same studios. So it really would have been impolite to hold out very much longer on Sesame Street, and it finally debuted in the Midlands in July 1977. Followed that November by Southern, and the following July by Border. Grampian finally brought it back at the same time, and in 1979, STV finally made Bert and Ernie available across all of Scotland. That just left, as the 80s dawned, Anglia, Yorkshire and Tyne-Tees. The former finally took it on in the summer of 1981, and the two famously resistant northern franchises, who often had to be electrocuted into taking on anything the rest of the national network was showing, finally gave in the following March. And so, on March 29th, 1982, 12 and a half years into the show's existence, Sesame Street was finally broadcast nationwide for the first time. Albeit not the same episodes at the same times. The Patchwork system came to an end in 1987, when a grateful now IBA unloaded it onto Channel 4, which was now big enough and old enough to broadcast in the mornings. For the first time, the same episodes were broadcast across the entire UK at the same time. And there it stayed as a lunchtime fixture, finally doing its intended job of educating at least 2 generations worth of preschoolers, albeit occasionally getting it wrong.
Look like letter Z.
Said until 2001, when the ratings went into decline. Channel 4 started to lose interest. Sesame Street lost its daily slot that March and started to gently drift through the schedules, eventually landing in the small hours of Saturday morning for 6 months, before winking out of existence altogether in favour of Channel 4's very own original creature shop furnished preschool show, The Hoobs. Sesame Street has been gone from British screens ever since, in its original configuration. There have been spin-offs since then, such as Elmo's World and Play With Me Sesame, and those have showed up on Channel 5. But 5 have ruled out showing the full series because it conflicts with their policy of redubbing imports with British voices, and also because using puppets is outdated. The BBC stands by its original judgment back in 1970, at least the part about how Sesame Street was filling a void in American television that was already filled over here. However, they have broadcast 2 British spin-offs in Northern Ireland's Sesame Tree, and more recently the Furchester Hotel, which is the closest thing to actual proper Sesame Street being broadcast nationwide. It's still only a spin-off, but the likes of Big Bird and the Count pop in from time to time, and Elmo squats there like a furry red Ballard Berkeley, and the head waiter is the Cookie Monster. You take what you can get. You've been watching a Bob the Fish production. Thanks! If you haven't found it already, be sure to check out our website at bobthefish.org.uk. Literally hundreds of videos not unlike this one that will make you laugh, think and realise new things, or your money back. Which works out great because they're all absolutely free. All of this is possible thanks to the not unique way that Bob the Fish productions are paid for by you, the viewing public, via Patreon. For a donation of as little as £1 a month, not only do you ensure that I still have food and shelter so I can carry on making these programmes, but you could become eligible for a whole host of cool extras. New video essays, special event live streams, all my content a week in advance, and my book on the history of the BBC, Rule the Waves, chapter by chapter as it's written. And some cake, if you go out and buy a cake and eat it while you're watching. And if you don't want to support on a monthly basis, you can make a one-off donation via Coffee. It all helps stave off scurvy. bobthefish.org.uk. You make it what it is.